the IAEA says it has found landmines at Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia power plant. The site, which is Europe's largest nuclear power plant, is occupied by Russian forces. On Sunday, experts from the International Atomic Energy Agency found mines in a buffer zone between the internal and external boundary. They said any detonation should not affect nuclear safety and security, but the watchdog warned that laying explosives breached its safety standards and created additional psychological pressure on staff. Let's bring in our correspondent, Nick Conley, here. He's in Kyiv. Nick, experts from the International Atomic Energy Agency have found mines around the nuclear plant. How dangerous is the situation there?
Well, these mines they're talking about are on the perimeter. They say even if they were to detonate, it wouldn't necessarily cause a dangerous nuclear incident, but there's no sense that this report is in any way conclusive. Those monitors are not free to move around the power plant. They have to ask permission of the Russian occupying forces there. Sometimes they wait weeks and are not given that permission. For instance, they haven't had access to the roofs of reactors number 3 and 4, where Ukrainian security services say that the Russians have installed what look like explosive devices, so they can spend weeks unsuccessfully asking for that permission. There's also suggestion from analysts here in Kiev that basically the Russians are playing a game of cat and mouse, that they maybe install mines or other kinds of weapon systems and then take them away just for the time that the inspectors are there. So there is a real sense that even though these inspections are going on, even though those watchdogs are trying to keep out of the kind of political game and demonstrate to all sides that they are outside of the politics, there is no sense that we have a real kind of clear 360-degree image picture of what's going on there.
Now, the Russian-installed operators of that nuclear plant have announced that one of the reactors there is going from cold to hot shutdown. What does that mean, Nick, for the safety situation?
Well, the Ukrainian nuclear power company has called this out, said this is against all the rules, all the kind of protocols for safety. The Russian occupation forces there on the ground say this is to provide steam, to provide energy for the power plant, because the last remaining reactor that had been on so-called hot shutdown is now being turned off, as it were. I think the important thing to realize here that this is a very difficult situation, a very dangerous situation. All along, we have a situation where water in the reservoir, the Kakhovka reservoir, is basically becoming lower and lower. There's less in the way of water to cool. There is a constant issue with power coming in from outside to provide that cooling for the reactors. So there are lots of different potential triggers for security safety issues. I think we've kind of taken our eyes off the ball. There was a phase earlier on in the war where that fact that Europe's biggest nuclear power station is basically an active war zone just a few dozen kilometers away from active fighting, with Russian troops, according to the Ukrainian side, basically using it as cover to kind of hide in a place that they know the Ukrainians won't attack. That kind of has been forgotten, or is occasionally kind of just returned to very occasionally when these inspections happen. So there's a real sense here in Kiev that this is still very, very dangerous and that the world needs to pay more attention to this.
Nick, thank you very much. That was our correspondent, Nick Conley, there in Kyiv. Well, it's been more than 500 days now since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Millions will remember what they were doing the day the war started. But for Katerina Semenyuk, it was especially memorable. It's the day she gave birth to her son, Luka. After her story made headlines around the world, she's started working full-time to support others, especially women living near the front lines.
Luka was born weeks before his due date by emergency cesarean. Not only that, but his mother Katerina had just seen and heard the first Russian missile strikes on her city when she went into labor. It was February 24th, 2022, the first day of Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
That picture of us in the bunker went around the world. We had people calling us, asking if they could help, asking me if we needed nappies. I told them that we were doing okay as a family, but that the country needed help. Suddenly all these boxes just arrived in Ukraine addressed to Katya. A truck came with 20 tons of supplies, and each box just had Katya on it. I was getting calls. There's another shipment here for you. Lots of boxes. I couldn't get my head around it. What was I going to do with all that baby formula?
What started as an improvised response to a wave of support from across the world has now become a professional operation. Dozens of volunteers coordinate tons of supplies arriving weekly from donors across Europe. Formula and nappies are still in demand, but now there are new needs.
These are the best tourniquets you can find. We send them straight to the units fighting. One of the paramedics said to me, each one of these is a life saved.
With millions of people uprooted by war and many called to fight for the very first time, Katerina realized many people needed more than material support. They needed to talk. She decided to train as a chaplain.
Lots of what we do is just talking to people. They message us from the front lines. It can be as simple as them asking us to pray for them when they come under intense fire, or thanking us for keeping them in our prayers. We check in with them, remind them we have their backs, we're waiting for them. We tell them they don't need to worry about their families. We'll look after them. They just have to hold on.
Not all of Katerina's work is done over the phone. Visits to civilians and soldiers on the front lines are also part of the job.
Of course there are dangerous situations. There are drones in the sky, grenades and mortars that don't distinguish between civilians and soldiers, men and women. I get lots of pushback from people who say, as a mother, I shouldn't be going anywhere near the front lines.
She says that criticism isn't always about the real risks involved. Her team travels with security and armored cars. She says it's about her gender.
Many people can't get their heads around the idea of a female chaplain. Our society is conservative. But there are groups who only we, as women chaplains, can reach. Women who have lived under occupation, who've been tortured, or experienced sexual violence. They would never go and talk about all of that to a male chaplain. It's not the chaplain's fault. It's just that the barriers are still very much there. Female chaplains are still a rarity. But there are more of us all the time.
And the country is certainly going to need every one of them. More than a third of Ukrainians say they personally know someone who has been killed or wounded in the fighting.